Now, committee stage, and we look at the amendments here. Section 1, First Amendment in the name of Deputy Thomas Pringle. New section 1 and 2 are related, will be discussed together. Deputy Pringle.
Thank you, Last Corla. Minister, this amendment intends to amend Section 2 of the 77 Act by inserting two subsections, just amending the subsections to allow for the Oireachtas to pass the declaration in relation to the control of a substance that's proposed to be done under the Act. And you have mentioned in your contribution there that primary legislation has to be brought forward every time in the interim period while we're waiting for the other legislation to come through. So this amendment attempts to try and deal with that issue and to try and ensure that the operation of banning substances into the future can continue on, and I think that's vitally important in the interim period. As I understand it, the declarations would have to be prepared anyway for the SI to be brought forward, to be done within the department. So what this amendment is hoping to do is to actually have a provision there for that just to be brought before the Houses here so that it can be voted on and passed as well in order to ban a substance in that interim period.
Come on, Deputy John Halligan.
Thanks, Last Corla. I think it's interesting the debate took place in the House here today, a very fruitful and rewarding debate on the issue as to how serious the problem is of drugs in Ireland. And I think it's valuable that we don't get too many opportunities in the House to discuss this very serious problem. And I would agree with this amendment. I think it's well thought out that there isn't any reason as to why, if there's any change in further to any substance, any declared substance, that it gives this House an opportunity to debate the very sensitive issue and the very serious issue of drugs abuse. But also I think that this House, this is the legislative assembly of this country, and every issue that can possibly be discussed in this House should be discussed in this House and debated in this House. And it may look simplified to some people that on the designation of a particular drug or something that may happen in the future that should be decided by a particular department. But this is such a serious issue throughout the country. I think it's valuable that any opportunity we get to debate the issue on drugs should be brought before the Oireachtas. I think this is the body that should make the decisions, not a particular department. Like in fairness, particular issues that are brought before the health, in health, education and so on, nearly invariably come before the Dáil and come before the Oireachtas to be debated on or voted on. And I think the same should apply, so I support this amendment.
Minister?
I don't pose to support this amendment, but in reality it's unnecessary as a result of the court decision today. Any substance that we may wish to add to the list of controlled substances can only be done so by the House of the Oireachtas. So should the government deem it necessary to control another 5 or 10 or 6 substances next week or in 3 weeks' time, it will be necessary to do so by putting legislation through the Dáil and Shannon. I personally don't think that's a good idea, quite frankly. There are so many of these substances. I think it would be very cumbersome for us to have to potentially recall the Dáil and Shannon on regular occasions just to control a particular substance. But what I will do later on in the year is bring forward legislation setting out the policies and principles, thus satisfying the court judgment today that would allow us to continue to, or to resume prohibiting substances by order, or potentially by statutory instrument, which would then involve at least laying it before the House of the Oireachtas and allowing Oireachtas members who disagree with it to challenge it. But as things stand, as a result of the court judgment today and the legislation that we're putting through tonight, any additions to the schedule will require primary legislation, so the amendments are necessary.
Sorry, Deputy Sullivan.
Just briefly, I mean, As we are debating here now, I'm quite sure that there are scientists, I use the word in inverted brackets, at the behest of drug dealers who are working on new drugs, some combination of what's there already, or some combination that will replace what's going to be on the schedule. So from my point of view and from where I represent, time is of the essence when any of these new drugs appear. And I've absolutely no doubt there could be another new drug appearing tomorrow, some combination of what is there now. So what can happen is if we don't move quickly enough on these new drugs as they are appearing, they're going to grab a hold of young people or older people or whoever. And when the time comes for the legislation, it's going to be too late for many of them. And I've been looking at the past while at the Gardaí, and we have a very good community policing initiative in the North Inner City, in Dublin Central. And I'm looking at the way in which their hands are tied because of the lack of legislation. And I can see that, okay, what you're bringing in now will cover some amount, but it's not going to cover everything. And the Gardaí's hands will be tied in the future. It has to be action when it's needed and not at a later date, when at that stage we've probably gone on to another drug. So it's disappointing that you're not taking the amendment, but if you're not taking it, I really want to see that there can be more prompt and more urgent response to when new drugs appear.
Deputy Pringle?
Can I
Yes.
just want to say, Minister, I think the amendment attempts to shorten the process for prescribing new drugs, and the fact you've said that you have to bring in primary legislation every time you want to do that, and obviously that is more cumbersome. The previous system had been by declaration that the department could declare it. I mean, I don't see why it should be unnecessary to have that declaration just brought before the Houses here, so that it can be passed, and that wouldn't be a quicker process and an easier administrative process than actually introducing primary legislation every time this has to be done. And as Deputy O'Sullivan has said, the issue is that, and I know you intend to bring forward the legislation later on this year, but I mean that could be in December of this year, and then by the time it passes through the Houses, indeed the doll could fall, and we'd be left then for the next government to come in and reinstate the legislation. So I think a system whereby the declaration can be put before the Houses and adopted seems to me a way to react quicker and a way to react more positively to actually adding to the list of substances rather than having to do primary legislation all the time. So I would ask you to give that serious consideration.
No, I understood the Minister's response from the earlier engagement that the situation now was that to add substances to the banned list would require legislation until such time as the Minister prepares new legislation to restore the opportunity for the Minister of the day to issue a statutory instrument prescribing any new substance. I have sympathy with the case made by Deputy Pringle, but my real concern was the Minister's response, where he said that, this is not a course that he would like to take, and he talks about, months and months. The passage of some considerable time. The new legislation of which he speaks will take considerable time to prepare, and there will indeed be very particular scrutiny by the Attorney General, given all that has happened in relation to the legislation already in place by this morning's judgment. So I would be concerned that there are, as Deputy O'Sullivan said, new substances coming on stream almost week by week, and very particularly in the area of so-called legal highs that I've raised with the Minister directly earlier today and in a number of fora here over recent months. They come under a whole variety of different names, and they're being reinvented to suit the purpose of their producers and promoters. And I don't think it's good enough to think that, the rest of this year could go by and we won't be responding to these. My hope is that we will be responding to them with all of the speed required, and that we would, as I said in my contribution earlier, endeavour to be 1 foot ahead of these purveyors of death. So I would appeal to the Minister not to think in terms of we'll park this. We won't park it. We mustn't park it. We need to be proactive and to be quite prepared to even go through the mechanics of legislation. If that is what is required in the interim period, I have no objection to having legislation presented here every other week, if necessary, if that helps in the battle against these illegal drugs, as they should be properly designated. Thank you.
So I'll call on the Minister.
Yes, sorry, I may have misunderstood the intention of your amendment. Initially, it is an attempt to make my life easier, quite frankly, and to allow the Minister for Health to prohibit things by declaration. The problem is the judgment today doesn't allow that. The judgment today is very clear, and the judgment states, therefore, for all of the reasons stated in the judgment, the conclusion is that Section 2, subsection 2 of the 1977 Act purports to vest the government with what, in absence of appropriate principles and policies set out in legislation itself, are in truth lawmaking powers, is accordingly unavoidable. And for this reason, it was struck down. So what we will have to do is bring in legislation that sets out the policies and principles by which any declaration or SI or order would be made. And that's essentially why this was struck down. Was for that reason. I should say that back in January, when I was seeking approval for this emergency legislation, preparing for this eventuality, I sought at the same time government approval to draft the new legislation that's now required. So actually, work is already 2 months underway on the new legislation. So I hope it isn't going to take us too long. But in the absence of laying down principles and procedures, we just aren't. It just wouldn't be adequate.
So Deputy Pringle, could I ask if there's only how stands the amendment? Yeah. Sure.
The judgment is that the court said that in the absence of the Oireachtas making the decision, there's no principles or policies laid down there, but this amendment actually provides that the Oireachtas makes a decision, and that's the body that's vested with the power under the Constitution to make laws within the state. So I would think that there's an assumption there that if the Oireachtas actually decides to add a substance to it, that is consideration under the Act, and that is the policy and principle as decided by the Oireachtas and as the legislature, rather than as by the department as an executive body.
Deputy Hannigan, okay, you're fine. So, Minister, do you have to respond to that?
The advice that I have is that essentially to bring in a statutory instrument which could then be put before the Oireachtas, there would have to be policies and principles laid down in law in the first instance to allow that to be done. So the only mechanism that we could use to allow the Oireachtas to ban new substances is primary legislation, because a declaration or a statutory instrument that I would lay before the House would have to have policies and principles underpinning it in primary legislation, and therein lies the difficulty.
I don't know if that's correct.
Well,
That's the advice I have.
I have to ask Deputy Pringle how stands the amendment.
Move the amendment.
Amendment being pressed, yeah. Then the question is the Chakti or Heavenly Cash Job Tá, Chakti and the Green Job Heeb, she will boot chain cash, in my opinion. The amendment is lost. Amendment lost. Vote all. Vote all.